All right, then, let's talk about history. All right, let's look at the notes. And the weekly question for this week is once again, women. We'll look at it one more time. How do women react to the language of freedom and liberty? Be sure to include in your response Abigail Adams' opinions, your voices of freedom. So let me grab my book. Quick. I know you guys probably have yours handy as well. And then the question for chapter 7, which we'll probably start to go over today a little bit, is how did the framers of the Constitution balance competing claims, local self-government? All right. So, and notes. All right. Oh, somebody's coming in. So, with the question this week about women and how they viewed liberty in the face of, in the face, oh, goodness, of the revolution. The Voices of Freedom excerpt on page 248, you might want to look at. And I know we talked about the letters between Abigail and John Adams and how they knew those were public documents. But she's reminding her husband as they begin to discuss the kind of the pre-Constitution, not the pre-Constitution, but the Declaration of Independence, or declaring independence, the ideas of liberty within the new country, because notice the date on this is March of 1776. So it's before the or before the Declaration of Independence, but after the fighting has started. And she's saying, it's time for you to make an account for legal rights for women. And she's talking about how this would be according to natural law, that would be according to Christian principle. And she says, just because men of the past haven't done this yet doesn't mean it isn't time, because we are having a rebellion, a revolution. It isn't time for you also to remember the ladies as well, because they also feel determined. We also feel determined to have, or we being from her perspective, also feel determined to have our rights protected and upheld. And she says, you have to admit that you guys are typically tyrannical toward us, and it is time for that to be changed. And if you go back and look, I know there's discussion, you could also talk about Phyllis Wheatley if you like, but there was a discussion about this in the beginning of the chapter as well that you could peek at, where it talked about how women viewed liberty. Dr. Fodor, as you've already noticed, is pretty big about going through and looking at each section, are many different groups and how they view liberty. So the chapter opened on 216 with a discussion of Abigail Adams again, and it really is a lot of quotes from that same voices of the same excerpt that was listed. So I think if you look at the beginning of the chapter and you look at that excerpt from Abigail Adams, I think you'll be okay there. And you could bring in some discussion as well of women who were helpful in the revolution. You could talk about Mercy Otis Warren, who's a historian from that era. You could talk a little bit about Judith Sargent Murray, who's an educator from that era. And then the section where it talks about gender and politics on 245. So talks about Deborah Sampson, who fights in the revolution. So talks about Esther Reed and Ben Franklin's daughter, Sarah. So there are definitely women who are involved in the actual revolution. There are women who are involved in the promotion of the revolution, and the idea that women are traditionally submissive and irrational is discussed in this section, and how there's a pushback against that. So most men, of course, are not in that era, are not going to agree that it's time for women to have full equal rights, to have political rights, or even the right to vote. But it also mentions in here that even Henry Knox, who is a fairly famous general from this era, his wife wrote to him and said, "You may be commander in chief of your army, but you're not commander in chief of the household," which is always a nice reminder. So, and the Quaker women, of course, uh, the Quaker group is you know, fairly famous for equality. So there it mentions a group of women who wrote to the early Congress and said, you know, it's time for you to start to write laws that prevent allowing men from harassing women, from mistreating women. And then it talks about the importance of Republican motherhood. Now, and I think I've mentioned already that if you discuss Republican motherhood, would you at the very least define it? Don't just say women saw their role in Republican motherhood as important. They did, but you need to explain what Republican motherhood is. But there's a lot of detail, especially toward the end of the chapter, that can help you as you answer this question. I feel like we've been over this a couple times, so I don't want to keep going over it in a way that's going to drive you crazy and not be terribly helpful. Sorry that I scrolled back or scrolled over all the stuff that we were supposed to talk about today. But and the general idea of Republican motherhood, in case we haven't gone over that to the point where you're crazy and it's like I can't hear about it anymore. The idea that national morality really needs to be fostered at home. It needs to start in private families. Even in places like Massachusetts, where they would have public school, the primary role of, of establishing morality, excuse me, national pride, that sort of stuff should start at the home. And what starts at the home is the background of the education, or the background of the revolution, a little bit of the theory of the revolution, but also just reading and writing. So basic education and making sure that children are able to comprehend uh, or that have the ability to read about politics, to understand politics, that sort of stuff. The politics and current events should be discussed at home. And if women don't have a foundational education and an interest in those things, they're not going to be sufficient Republican mothers. So, and it's that idea as well that if we have a republic, if we can keep it, and part of the way that we can keep it is to ensure that our population, that our populace is educated and engaged. So that's certainly a belief that these folks had in a strong way during that era. Okay, all right. I feel like we've been over that a bunch. So let's start to talk about the Constitution and how we ended up with some compromises for the Constitution. And oh, I am so sorry. Excuse me for the big yawn. Peek at the weekly question for this one, just to make sure. So it was, how did the framers of the Constitution balance competing claims of local self-government, sectional interest, and national authority? Yeah, okay. All right, so back to the notes. So sorry, back to the notes. All right. So you probably know a little bit about the Articles of Confederation. So the Articles of Confederation were the original Constitution of the United States. And this was written in and drafted by Congress in written in 1777, adopted in 1781. So this is going to be what is used, or the ideas of this are used to complete the revolution, to begin the United States, to kind of get things rolling. And you remember that one of the major concerns that the states had was that King George III had too much power. So this is a document, Articles of Confederation, that's designed to be intentionally weak on the federal side and stronger on the state side. So it's referred to within the document as a firm league of friendship, which I'm not sure if we currently think of our federal government as a firm league of friendship, but that was their goal. They really wanted to create an organization or a structure that would allow for common defense. So they wanted to make sure that the states could defend themselves, and that certain decisions might be able to be made that would protect the borders and maybe enhance trade. It's primarily protect the borders. Okay, it does declare that the states are a perpetual union, and that may be important when we discuss things later on related to the idea of the Civil War. But it's a binding agreement of some sort that everyone would be together, that they would make decisions. It sets up a legislature. It doesn't set up anything other than a legislature, so there's no president. So you have a legislature. It is a single house legislature, so there's no House and Senate. It's just the Continental or Confederation Congress. So the Confederation Congress is set up, and each state gets one member, or excuse me, one vote. They can have a coalition of people that come together to make that vote. Most states typically had between 3 and 7 people attend the Confederation Congress, but each state had one vote. So they all had to agree. And there's no president to enforce the laws. There's no judiciary to adjudicate, interpret them. And major decisions typically required 9 of 13 votes rather than a simple majority. So as you can imagine, it means there were not very many major decisions because it's hard to get 9 of 13 states to agree on much of anything. So the powers that are granted to the states in the articles are pretty basic things: declaring war, conducting foreign affairs, and making treaties. So Congress doesn't have any money to do any of this stuff. They can ask for taxes, but they can't enforce collection of taxes. So they could say like, hey, we need money for this, please send it. But if you didn't send the money, if your state didn't send the money to the federal government, there wasn't any way to enforce taxation power. So you could ask for taxes but not require them. I can remember discussing this when I just taught high school students, and I would say it would be like in the school cafeteria if they told you lunch is $3 and you pick up your lunch, and instead of the nice lunch lady at the end of the line to collect your money or to swipe your card or however the pay works, I know you probably have an account of some sort, they just had a bucket and said, put the money in here. So most people are not going to put the money in there. And, occasionally people would, and other people would steal it or something, but there's not going to be any sort of collection power for taxes. Also, each state could have its own currency, and they did. And so the states could have reciprocal agreements with each other about how they would accept each other's currency. So you would have exchange rates from state to state. The different states could make commerce deals with other countries. So they could make trade deals with England, well, probably not England during the Revolution, but they could make trade deals with France or the Netherlands or some other country. Also, they could start to claim Western land. So if you had a Western border, you could claim Western land. If you didn't have a Western border, it's going to be harder to claim Western land. So I'm sure Massachusetts not super excited about this, although they did go up and grab what becomes Maine later on. But New Hampshire and Vermont really aren't going to get in on this because they're not going to have an opportunity to claim land in the West. Georgia, the Carolinas, Virginia, of course, Connecticut. Connecticut, yep. Connecticut's going to claim some land as well. What the system really creates is a system where each state is kind of in for their own well-being, which makes sense. And they're not really concerned about the well-being of the entire nation. Now, they do want to win the revolution because then, their state can't do its thing. And they may or may not help states that are close to them, but there's not a lot of incentive. If something goes down in New York, there's not a lot of incentive for Georgia to say, like, yeah, we'll contribute money and soldiers to help defend New York because it's so far away. So this system is not going to create that union that we would expect within the United States. They're not terribly united. They're, as the document says, in a firm league of friendship. So this is going to create it will create some issues between the states. So, and those issues are the ones that I just mentioned. So it's difficult for certain states to decide they want to help defend other states. States with western borders are going to be able to claim new land, where states without western borders are not going to be able to claim that land. When troops are needed in one part of the country, the other part of the country may or may not contribute them. If the entire country needs money for something, maybe they've created a treaty or they want to enforce something and they need money to do that. You can't force the collection of taxes. So it turns out to be, it creates a lot of problems. Now, I am not going to suggest to you that it was not without successes. Certainly the Northwest Ordinance and is a success of this government. What the Northwest Ordinance does, a previous land ordinance and then the Northwest Ordinance, what these things do, what these laws do, is they create systems by which you allow new territory to enter the United States. And these systems allowed townships to be developed, and those townships had taxing entities built in by section, and those townships also, as they raised money, established public schools. And the Northwest Ordinance in particular was unusual because it said that slavery would not be allowed in that territory. So there were some successes in the Articles of Confederation. They were able to begin to regulate Western land policy. They were able to begin to set up governments and basic principles of government in those Western lands. And sometimes they did important things like set up public schools or end slavery. Or not allow slavery, I guess I should say, in certain territories. So not necessarily without success. Plus, under that document, the United States was also able to win the American Revolution. So not without success, however, problems. Okay, so weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation, we've already mentioned. Financing stuff is hard. So they're going to create a national currency. They're going to borrow money to help pay soldiers, and they pay them in that national currency, but nobody accepts that national currency, and it's not required to be used by the states. So the national currency is highly inflated and is not worth very much money. It's just not worth very much. So it's problematic. So currency is an issue, and tariff policy is an issue. The book talks a little bit about how people want to trade for certain goods, And so they started doing that, but trade agreements were made by states often or by individuals, but not by the federal government. So trade from state to state is different, currency from state to state is different. The use of the national currency is pretty much non-existent, but soldiers were getting paid in that national currency, which they couldn't use anywhere. So a lot of economic issues. And when we start to have national debt or state debt, figuring out how to pay for that debt is going to be difficult. And then when creditors are trying to collect debt from people who purchase things from them, there's not much regulation of that either. And if you're thinking, well, that's really more of a private personal issue, it is kind of, except when states are trying to collect debt as well, um, and they are not able to do this. One of the big problems that arises during this era, because the money is, it's harder to regulate, they start to, individual states start to charge pretty high land taxes. And because of the currency issues and inflation, there were lots of people who really had difficulties paying these land taxes. And the example that they use, which is, it's a good example, I mean, it's an important example, is Shays' Rebellion. And Daniel Shays was a Revolutionary War hero, so everybody kind of knew he was a semi-famous kind of dude. And he retires from the military, stops, not formally retired, but the war's over, so he goes home and he wants to farm. So he's got his farm and he's not able to pay the taxes on the farm. Now, the legislature in Massachusetts is controlled primarily by businessmen rather than farmers. So these businessmen decide that the best way to pay off the debt is to tax farmers really heavily on their land. So rather than having a big business tax, you have a big farm or land tax for farmers. And the farmers feel like they're underrepresented in the legislature because, well, they are, and because the legislature is on the coast. So it's near Boston, and the people who live in the countryside don't live close to that, and they tend not to get elected to the legislature. So the people in the legislature are really more in favor of the interest of people in Boston. So Daniel Shays can't pay his taxes, and they're about to foreclose on his farm. So he decides to start to raise a local militia. And he raises a local militia, and they go to the bankruptcy courts with their weapons and they say, you know what, we don't think we're going to pay our taxes. And the bankruptcy court said, we notice you have weapons. We don't blame you. We're just shutting down for the day. So they essentially take up arms and they shut down the bankruptcy courts so that people don't get their land foreclosed on. And then the state legislature has to decide, what do we do here? How do we stop this? Do we send the state militia? Well, we can't do that because most of the state militia are those landowners in the country. So that's probably not going to work out very well. So what they end up doing is the governor raises a private army, and they're paid mostly by Boston businessmen to go to reopen those courts and arrest some of the rebels. So it creates quite a controversy and, a huge problem. I know we have over the last year had some unusual situations in our country, and in certain cities you've seen people, be more or less violent, that sort of thing. But if you had just an open rebellion between people and the courts and the state militia, they essentially had a little tiny civil war. Now, some of the more national leaders were very distressed about this because they felt like people weren't following the law. Others were less distressed about it because they felt like the law itself had been unfair, and that the law was allowing abuses of power. But that the answer, taking up arms to fight the law, isn't probably the best answer either. So the book will talk about Thomas Jefferson saying, it's where that famous quote, "The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants." It comes from this incident. That's how Jefferson felt. He said, you know what? Sometimes people rebel and it makes us re-examine what we're doing, so it's not necessarily bad. That is not how most of the founding fathers felt. George Washington and James Madison, most notably, and Henry Knox. The military guys in general don't like this because they think that there are rules, you should follow them, and you shouldn't just fight against every rule because this is the new country, we can elect officials, so you should just elect officials. The people who took up arms are going to argue that the elected officials weren't doing what they were supposed to do. What ends up happening as a result of this, in addition to about 1,000 people getting arrested, is their state legislature ends up changing some of the laws about taxation to make them more fair. So it does end up with the desired result, but there's a lot of violence in the meantime, and people go to jail, and it's a little more traumatic than most of the founding fathers want. Plus, some of the founding fathers are concerned that there would be a state of perpetual rebellion within the United States, and they're not interested in that at all. They didn't create a new country they didn't create a new country because they wanted to be in a country that's constantly at war. They wanted the rule of law in some ways. And it's funny too, or maybe not, I don't know. Some of the people, most notably Samuel Adams, who owns businesses in Boston, is going to be frustrated at these rebels, and he's going to demand that the full force of the law come down on them. And people are going to see that as maybe slightly hypocritical because he was the leader of the Sons of Liberty and one of the guys that threw tea in the ocean, that sort of thing. So it creates a pretty good turmoil within the United States, within Boston, or excuse me, Massachusetts in particular, but within Boston, Massachusetts in particular, but throughout the United States as well. So what ends up happening is there is a constitutional convention that's called. So they decide to call a constitutional convention to perhaps revise the Articles of Confederation to at least allow for a military that could be called up to deal with certain crisis situations. So Shays' Rebellion leads the people in the United States who are involved in making the laws to think that maybe a stronger national government wouldn't be all bad, because if you can't protect your property, your life, your liberty, and your property, then you can't protect your property, you can't protect your life and liberty. And if those things can't be protected, then you don't really have a country and you don't really have a working government. So it's time to have a working federal government that works together with the local or the state governments. So they first declare a convention, and it's supposed to meet in Annapolis in Maryland, but not enough people were able to come. So they kind of outline what's going to happen later, and they say, let's get together again in May, and we'll get all of the states there to discuss this. Now, the Articles of Confederation said that if you wanted to revise this document, that you needed 13 of 13 states to agree to do this. So at that Annapolis meeting, I think there were only 6 states there, maybe 6 or 7, yeah, 6. So that decision to call another meeting isn't technically legal, but since most of the states show up for the other meeting, then it continues and they work on a document. Okay, so the document that they work on will later be known as the Constitution. And it mentions that 55 people will come to the Constitutional Convention. And it mentions who they are. It'll talk about George Mason, who was a very prominent in Virginia politics, Benjamin Franklin, whom we've heard of, and he's old as dirt at this point. He's 81. John Adams, who they make fun of a little bit for being kind of chunky, which seems sort of rude, don't you think? Alexander Hamilton, who later will have a musical about him, so you may know more about him than some of the other founding fathers. He had grown up poor, so he has a very different perspective. It mentions that almost everybody, well, about half of the people at the Constitutional Convention owned slaves. Some of them owned quite a few slaves. Most of these folks had college education, more than half of them did, in a time period where literally statistically nobody went to college. So the reason they point out these statistics is to let you know that these guys are not average in any way. They have more money, they have more education, and they're more prominent. I mean, they're more prominent socioeconomically. They usually are already leaders in their states as well. Now, between the Annapolis Convention and the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, James Madison, who lives in Virginia, slaveholder, plantation owner, but really his goal in life was to be more of a lawyer, decides to study and prepare for this Constitutional Convention. So he studies the republics, the documents, the constitutions of every republic that has ever been. So he studies all of the constitutions, all of the things that go well for republics, all of the things that go poorly for republics, and he decides to come into this convention with a document that he thinks will best outline the most likely success of this new document. So he comes in with something called the Virginia Plan, and it says there should be a two-house legislature. It says that both houses should be represented by population, and this is not completely popular with states that have smaller populations. So it's countered by something called the New Jersey Plan, which says that there should be a single house legislature, that each state should get one vote, very similar to the Articles of Confederation. So they end up compromising between those two plans, but because the Virginia Plan had been, more thought out, more prepared, you're going to see more aspects or elements, excuse me, of the Virginia Plan in this original document. So what you end up seeing with the legislature is the two houses, on one where you have equal representation, that would be the Senate, and then the House where you have proportional representation. So more members if you have more people within your state. So it's supposed to balance the interest of small and large states. So that's one of the things, and that's part of, it's the beginning of an answer to your weekly question as well. And I know that it's probably really, wasn't paying attention to time, was I? Oh no, we're still good. We have about 10 minutes. Like, oh my goodness, did I go over? No, I didn't. That's good. Apologies. So you have the Virginia and New Jersey plans, but then there are lots of other things that need to be discussed. What are we going to do as far as having a chief executive? Is there going to be what essentially might be a president? And the concern about that would be if you created a system with a president, that person might end up with too much power. And if that person ends up with too much power, then we end up in a situation like we were in England, where maybe King George III, rather than governing with considering the rules of the Constitution, will do things that he thinks are in his best interest. So they really talk about the presidency for a long time. And you could read, if you wanted to, for your book review, notes on the federal Constitution. I would not suggest it. It's a James Madison. James Madison took notes about the proceedings, which in some ways they weren't really allowed to do. They weren't supposed to take notes during the meetings, but James Madison went home each night and took notes. And they weren't supposed to do that because they were supposed to keep this pretty much a secret from everybody until they came up with the final document. And the person who enforced the rules, if you didn't keep a secret, was George Washington. He was the sergeant at arms of the convention. So he made sure that, you know, you didn't cheat, that you didn't leave your notes at the bar in the evening, you know, that sort of thing. But James Madison went home and took notes. And so the notes on the federal Constitution are his notes. They're about 1,000 pages long, which is why I'm suggesting you don't read them. But the one thing that's interesting about them is it shows the process, you know, where they started and where they ended up. When they first start talking about a president, they first start talking about maybe 7 presidents, which would be fun, wouldn't it? 7 presidents. They end up deciding that it would be best to have 1 president and 1 vice president. That this president would be elected by popular vote, but they're going to end up creating the Electoral College to help filter the voice of the people, just on the off chance that the people go a little rogue. So it's a little messy. The other thing that they end up doing as well is they decide that the person who wins the election will be president, and the person who gets second place will be vice president. They will change that after an election or 2 because that doesn't work perfectly well, as you might imagine. And the book talks about how the Electoral College system probably limits democracy more than it enhances democracy. And certainly we have discussions about that even to this day. Also, I know when we had this current election, there was a lot of talk. I heard saw a lot of my friends on Facebook, so like, I know old people, like, they're going to get rid of the Electoral College now that Biden is president. Well, that's not really something that the president can just sign an executive order and do, because it's part of the Constitution. So getting rid of the Electoral College would probably be harder than it seems, even though for most of us, we look at that and go like, that thing's a mess, it's kind of confusing. But the smaller states appreciate that they still have some voice in this process. So they are less likely to want to get rid of the Electoral College than states like Texas, where the Electoral College probably doesn't benefit us as much. However, it's still in, you know, things work pretty well for Texas, I suppose. Oh, sorry for the yawn. As far as representation goes, okay. So, the way the Electoral College worked as well, that you got 1 vote per. Let's see. Let me try again. You get 1 vote for every certain number of people who live in your state, and you get 2 votes, 1 for each senator. So the smallest number of votes your state could have in the Electoral College is 3. So the smallest states like Alaska's got 3, probably Idaho has 3, you know, places, Wyoming, places where people don't really live. And then the larger states would have more representatives, based on how many people lived in their state. So it's essentially the number, it's based on your representation in Congress. So larger states have more voice, smaller states have less voice, but smaller states still have at least 3 votes, which is probably disproportionate to their population. All right, the book also talks about a system of federalism. So the idea of federalism is that there's shared power between the federal and the state governments. Also within the system of federalism, there's going to be a division of power and checks and balances between the different branches of the government, which is sometimes referred to as separation of powers. So you have federalism, which divides power between the federal government and the state government. And within the federal government, you have checks and balances between the different branches of government, which is sometimes known as separation of powers. So within federalism, there's a discussion of what is the best way to promote the general welfare of people within the United States. So there are certain things that are going to be handled at the national level, things like borders, things like military, things like trade policy, interstate commerce, that sort of thing. But there's still going to be things that happen at the local level or the state level. For the state level example in the modern era and that era too, whether you have public school, that's a state level decision, and how those schools are run, but also things like roads and bridges, and in the modern era, drinking age, that sort of stuff. So there are going to be some things that are decided more at the local or state level, and some things that are decided more at the federal level. One of the other things that's going to be debated heavily during the Constitution, of course, during this era and before, would be slavery. Okay. Now, one of the things that you probably are already aware of is, even though many of the founding fathers, most, I think it said, owned slaves, they understand that slavery as an institution is anti-democratic. They do understand that. I mean, that's the understatement of the day, isn't it? Owning another person is definitely anti-democratic. And they also have an understanding that there's something about slavery that is wrong. That when we're basing a government on liberty and natural freedom, that sort of stuff, but we're saying it's okay to own people, we know there's a contradiction there. But there are southern states who are not going to join this union or be a part of this government moving forward unless slavery is allowed to continue. So they're going to have a discussion about slavery, and they're going to allow slavery in the Constitution, but they are never going to say the word slavery in the Constitution. So it seems to create, an interesting conflict within the electors at the Constitutional Convention that they're unwilling to solve. And their thought is, we'll make some decisions here, and potentially later on, the people who follow us, once the country is unified, can begin the process of getting rid of slavery. At this point, lots of northern states had already enacted gradual emancipation. Certainly there were states that didn't allow slavery at all. And in the South, that wasn't true. It also discussed that the states where there are slaves, they want the slaves counted as part of their population. The reason they want their slaves counted as part of the population is it will give them more representation in the House of Representatives. The states where slavery wasn't allowed said, that's cool if you want to let them vote. And then, of course, the slaves who said, or the slave states said, no. So they ended up deciding that you could count the slaves 3/5 of the slave population as part of your population for purposes of representation. For purposes of representation, not that those slaves would get to vote or that 60% of those slaves would get to vote, but they decided that 3/5 would be the percentage, or 60% would be the percentage of slaves that they would allow to vote. And they decided that, not for any particular reason. I know when I was a child, I remember my elementary school teachers telling us, I don't know why I remember this, but I remember it. Our elementary school teachers telling us that they decided that you would count 3/5 of the slaves because they were 3/5 human, or 3/5 equal to or as good as white people, or something along those lines. And what I found out when I read parts of the Madison Notes on the Constitution is that's not the reason they decided it at all. That was just the compromise they reached, because they started with half, and the North said half, and the South said no, 100%. And for whatever reason, the percentage they agreed on was 60. So you end up with something called the 3/5 compromise. And part of the reason that the North was willing to do this, even though there were more people who lived in the North, there's more wealth in the North. Many of the founding fathers lived in Virginia and further south, and they also understood that a divided country would not be successful at this point. So one of the other compromises that they make as well is they agree, not in writing, but they agree to end the slave trade. So they agree to end the slave trade 20 years after the signing of this document. So it's an unwritten compromise, and it's an agreement that they say will help begin to establish the liberty that's discussed in the document, begin to be more consistent with it. Now, by abolishing the slave trade, it doesn't mean that they're ending slavery. It means that they are no longer allowing people to bring slaves in from outside the United States. So the Slave Trade and Commerce Compromise ends the slave trade, or the discussion of the slave trade. I'm sorry, let me try again. So the slave trade is going to end 20 years from the date of the signing of the document, and that commerce is going to be regulated as well. And part of that regulation will be the end of the slave trade. Okay, so we've got the 3/5 compromise, and we'll start next time, since I'm probably not doing a great job explaining this, with the slave trade and commerce compromise. So sorry for kind of an inept explanation there. We'll try again. But the basis, or the main thing about that, was that the slave trade would end 20 years after the signing of the document. And even though it's an unwritten part of this, because these compromises aren't written into the Constitution, they're agreed to in the Constitutional Convention. And part of their intention was to make sure that these things weren't written down, because they knew that the process of forming the Constitution was going to be, it was going to be controversial. You know what else is controversial? I'm still talking, and it's probably later than I should be talking. So let me stop sharing. We'll stop the recording.